So welcome everybody to Athletes and Activism Forum, sponsored by the University of Florida and the Clemens Consulting Group. Today's conversation is going to last about an hour. It'll be about 30 to 40 minutes of a discussion between Michelle and I, and we'll explain all the sessions. And then this sets up a forum of 5 different sessions that we are sponsoring through this program that Michelle will actually be hosting. But today we're actually going to reverse the roles. I'm going to be the host, and Michelle's going to be the talent to kind of give you a perspective on what we are trying to accomplish through this activity. So thanks for sparing an hour of your day with us. This video will be up on the website where you registered. So if you want to share it with anybody, or if you can't make a future session and you just, you're on here in a couple weeks and thought, I wonder what's going on in that forum, I missed all the other sessions, feel free to go back in there and you will find these videos posted there for you to use pretty much indefinitely. We don't plan on taking them down for a while. So again, thanks for joining us today. Welcome to the first session and the forum generally, in the first session of that forum today. As I mentioned, or as you probably saw in your invitation, when you register, this is sponsored by the College of Health Team Performance here at the University of Florida, the Department of Sport Management within that college, and particularly a lab that I oversee, the Laboratory for Athlete Development Research. And we're joined by Clemens Consulting Group Principal, CEO, founder, Michelle Clemens, and I'll have her introduce herself here in a minute. So collectively, we're going to put these 5 sessions together on a very relevant, timely topic on athletes and activism. So it's going to be a 5-part series. You can join us for as many or as few as you want, obviously. We'll send out the invitations for all of those. They'll be posted on that website. You can just have to get a Zoom link for each if you want to join us live. But again, you can also watch the archives as you see fit. Conversation that we're going to have around this, and we'll tee that up in a minute, exactly why we're doing this now. I mean, it's probably pretty obvious why we're doing this now. And some of the students, I see some students here that have taken my class, and they've probably seen Michelle. In 2018, she did a really nice interview for us on this topic. And what Michelle and I were talking here about 6 weeks ago, and we realized, everything that she talked about in that session is obsolete almost. I mean, this landscape has changed dramatically. And so we thought, well, should we update that, or should we do more than that? I think it really meant, we wanted a public-facing kind of opportunity to begin this conversation in a more serious way, rather than just a casual way, which we had a couple of years ago. So we'll get to that in a minute. But we're going to talk a little bit about the past, present, and future of activism. I mean, who realized that 6 months ago was the past, really. I mean, that the present has really changed. It's dramatically different in 2020 than it was just in 2019. And in the 2000s, since the Kaepernick era of activism has started, has really been what the present has been, and it's kind of a new normal right now. And a lot of us in the sport industry are curious how to navigate this and how to help our athletes and how to do our jobs better. So we'll talk about the future, trying to get at some of that, some of those ideas about how should we be engaging athletes in this space, because it is a very, very challenging space for athletes and for athlete development specialists and for anyone working with athletes in any way. As I mentioned, we'll go about an hour. We'll cut off, today 4 Eastern, Q&A format, hosted by Michelle for most of them. The first 3 dates are set. We're going to also have 2 dates in October. And we'll talk about, Michelle actually will talk briefly about each session here in a minute. And we'll try to go about a 40-20. Today we have a little housekeeping for 10, so we'll have about a 30-minute conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions. For questions, please drop them in the chat room. Everybody's muted right now, and if there's a question there, I'll unmute you, and you can ask your question, or even a comment. If you have some advice or insight that anyone on these panels didn't offer, and you can help the cause collectively of everybody on these, please share, because we're here to learn and advance this conversation. We're not here and that's the main reason we're here. This is an educational, intellectual pursuit to try to help our athletes and help us do our job better. Registration page, which you all found already, is going to be there. So again, if you want to go join us for the 9:10 or 9:22, you can go back to that page. Those links will be there. So I mentioned this started, and I'll hand it off to you, Michelle, and then I'll come back to me for the Q&A. 2018, Michelle was a master's student in our program, studying athlete development, master's in sport management. I joke with her a lot and tell her that it's her most prized degree, because she has a degree from Yale and from Columbia, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. and one from Florida. So, but they're probably all equal. I noticed the Florida one's behind you, so that has to be the best.
Absolutely.
We arranged through PADS. PADS is a professional association athlete development specialist. We were overseeing the curriculum there for the education. This is the research symposium at PADS. And I had nominated Michelle to be on a panel with Etan Thomas, who's kind of the voice of activism and athlete activism the last 3 or 4 years, very strong-minded individual. And she held her own. I joke, Etan was here in the fall. I joked with him and said, "You remember that one time you got your hat handed to you?" He goes, "Oh yeah, that was Michelle Clement. I remember it vividly. It's the only time ever now." But Etan came back here in November for a forum. He was really good, remembered this conversation. We talked about it. And he's done a lot to really move the needle. And I'd argue Michelle has as well. So I invited Michelle to campus in 2018. We had this 20-minute conversation. Some of my students have seen it, as I mentioned. And it's really obsolete. I really need to just delete that video, because everything that we talked about and that really leaned on Michelle's intellect and experience around this conversation has changed. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So Michelle, I'm going to have you go over the 5 sessions briefly, and then we'll get into today's session. So today we're going to we're just basically going to revisit the 2018 conversation. And actually, I'll go into the 8 questions here in a minute. You want to talk about the other sessions briefly?
Sure. So today, as Dr. Sagas has mentioned, and thank you, Dr. Sagas, for that introduction. Today, we're setting the framework and the parameters for these future discussions. So we're going to revisit our conversation from 2018 in light of all that's happened, like less than the last 2 years, and more specifically in the last 6 months. So that's session 2, and we've brought several scholars in to have that conversation. Dr. Maurice Hobson, Dr. Kenyatta Cavill, and Dr. Catherine Morgan will be our speakers, and we're gonna have a convene around the history of athletes engaging protest and activism in this country. And then after that, we're going to get perspective in session number 3. We're going to get the perspective from social justice advocates themselves, those people doing the on the ground work. And to that end, we're going to have T. Marie King, who's head of Local Voices Network Alabama. She's an activist here in the state and actually nationally. Diane Billings-Burford of the CEO of RISE, the Ross Initiative in Sports and Equality, and Damon Hewitt, who's the Executive Vice President of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law. So they will be bringing the perspective of folks doing the work on the ground and their insights around the contributions that athletes have made with regard to activism. And in session number 4, we're really fortunate to have the opportunity to hear about athlete activism from the business management side of the house. So we'll have the opportunity to hear from representatives from the Miami Heat, who can provide perspective and analysis for what this paradigm shift has looked like for them and how their players have reacted to it. And finally, in session number 5, it's the projecting out, where do we go from here? So the thoughts on where this moment will take us. And we're going to bring together scholars from both the media and academic space to come together and have that final conversation and make projections. And we're hoping throughout throughout the course of these series of conversations to tease out new ideas, to provoke thought and initiate conversation. There's so much around this landscape that's changed. And I know Dr. Sagas and I are both excited about it and hope that through the series of conversations, you get excited and invested in it too.
All right, so let's get on with session 1. I will tee it up a little, and then we'll get into some of the questions. Again, if you have a personal question or comment, please drop it in that chat room, the chat feature, and we'll get to you here in about 25 minutes. So session 1 is basically what we tried to accomplish a couple of years ago when we talked, and when you went toe to toe with Etan at PADS, was that's an athlete development space. Mm-hmm. What should we know in athlete development? We're working with athletes all the time. And what frameworks for discussing athletes and activism should we be using? So, and you actually did some work in this. We're going to show you the pre-post essentially of that model and the framework that you're recommending based on your research. So most of you should know who I am, or well, maybe not actually. There's probably half the people that don't, but I'm a professor in the Department of Sport Management. I oversee our athlete development program and do research in the space of athlete development. As I mentioned, I run the lab for athlete development research, and we work closely with PADS. And we've done a lot of work with them and offer a certification as an athlete development specialist through them. So Michelle, briefly give us a little bit about your background.
Sure. I am my background is I'm an employment law attorney as well as a former HR executive. I love history. I was a history major at Yale. I have a law degree from Columbia. The degree I am most proud of, though, is my Master's of Science from the University of Florida, which I received in 2018. I own my own HR consultancy, the Clemens Consulting Group, and the consultancy focuses in on preparing athletes for their transition into the career world, the professional world, once they're no longer athletes. While I was while I was a student at the University of Florida, I grew interested in this topic of athletes and activism. And I've continued to pursue that as a research passion since I graduated. And so that's what led to me being involved in the PADS conference a couple of years ago and having the opportunity to come back to Florida a couple of months after that, and that's the conversation in which Dr. Segas and I had this grounding conversation that we're going to reference frequently. So I'm really excited to have you all here. I'm thankful for the opportunity, Dr. Segas, again, and looking forward to renewing this conversation.
Thanks. And so back in 2018, we went back to the transcript, and I don't remember what I asked you, but I think there was 8 questions. I'm not going to read them here. We're going to go through these. I think we eliminated one question. Question 7 is no longer relevant, but and added a new one that we thought was more relevant. But we're basically going to go back through this. I'll challenge you on, if you say something different from your 2018 responses, and we'll use that as kind of a pivot to try to make sense of what's going on here and where we're going in this space. So first question I ask, and I can ask anyone on this call really, is something you have an opinion that's different than Michelle's. Please share. But in your opinion, Michelle, why do you think, and you're a scholar of this, you've written a paper, that's how we got you at PADS. You presented this research on a new model for athlete and activism. And this obviously you work in this space from a legal perspective. But in your opinion, why do you think athletes weigh in on and engage in social advocacy?
I think they engage for any number of reasons and factors, and those factors tend to fall, they're multi-level factors, and there's the framework that we've been referencing. And those factors fall at the macro, meso, and micro level. I'm referencing now my position as of 2018, but we'll update it to where I think we are in 2020. So we have these factors at the macro level. You're looking at what is the political spectrum look like in the country? What are institutionalized practices? And by that, I mean the racism as an institutional structure and infrastructure in this country. What are stakeholder expectations around players engaging in activism or not engaging in activism? Those are big 10,000 foot level factors. In the middle or the meso, you have these factors that you might call more regional or local. What team does the player play for? Where is that team located? What's the culture of the team? What's the demographic of the town in which the team is located? Those are meso level factors that can influence a player as well. And then finally, you have the micro level factors, those factors that are particular to that particular individual player. What is their identity? What's their connection to history? Are they intrinsically or extrinsically motivated? How much financial security do they have? What experiences do they bring from their upbringing that might inform their decisions around activism? So we have those 3 buckets that informed the framework, and we still have those buckets today, but I'll add more about how they've changed. So in 2018, this is what I proposed that dynamic looked like, that you had the macro, the meso, and the micro, and they're interacting, and there's some circuity to it, but they're kind of, there's this ebb and flow going. They're distinctly separate, but there's this constant ebb and flow kind of between them, as indicated by the arrows. And this is where I think, and this is how I think that framework has changed as of today. You'll notice that on the micro side of the house, I think the micro part has expanded. greatly. And that's why I have them highlighted in blue. Three of the factors I've identified were there before, but I've highlighted them in blue because I think they are greater than they were. They're more influential as factors than they were 2 years ago. I added to this, you'll see the fourth one, the perceived connection to victims of police brutality. Dr. Sagas, I don't think we're at this moment, I don't think we're having this conversation, frankly, if it weren't for the murder of George Floyd. And the country and the world having an opportunity to see a man die at the hands of the police state through an 8-minute 46-second crime. And the outrage that's generated throughout the world has us at this moment. And so people who might not have previously felt connected to instances of police brutality have found themselves connected by virtue of the widespread dissemination of that video. And so we're in this moment largely due to the George Floyd incident and the subsequent protests. So I think that, you know, and the political climate that we're in contributes to that enhanced influence as well. I would be remiss not to acknowledge that who we have in office as our president has, regardless of from a partisan standpoint, you agree or disagree with his perspective, this particular person being in office, President Trump being in office, has intensified the sense that has intensified race relations and the tensions with regard to race relations in this country. I think that's undeniable. And to that extent, that's influenced players' decisions around activism. I don't know that the meso has really changed all that much, and we'll hop to the next slide in just a second. I'll explain it more. But on the micro side, the factors that I've added are that individual players' personal experiences and interactions with law enforcement are a factor now too, perhaps more than they were a couple of years ago. And their level of political engagement, seeing candidates, seeing athletes support political candidates, I think also influences their decisions around activism. So on the next slide, you can see how I posit the dynamic has shifted over the last 2 years. You'll recall that in 2018, macro, meso, and micro were distinct and separate from one another. I'm suggesting that now both macro and meso have gotten larger and have kind of collapsed onto the meso. So the meso is a little less significant, and macro and micro are taking up all the space in the room. They're still interacting, but they're almost right on top of each other now, like where you can't separate the political climate from the individual experience. And I think that's the way in which things feel more intensified now. And I think that's the primary way in which things have shifted since 2018.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. Definitely a lot of differences. Has your definition, as we get to the second question, I ask you about the cost, real or otherwise, tangible, intangible, opportunity, or significant real cost. Before we get to that, do you think the definition of what is now activism has shifted at all in the last couple months?
I do, and I think that kind of fundamentally begs the question, kind of how are we defining activism, right? And so I think that, you know, a general definition, I don't know if you want to call it Webster's definition, but, you know, to me, activism is taking action to express support of or opposition to a cause, a policy, a law, or system, or an infrastructure. And you don't necessarily have to be seeking for something to be changed. You could be seeking for the status quo to remain and be an activist. I mean, as an example, and I don't want to get off topic, but if you just to provide, you know, to be illustrative, if you look at on the abortion debate issue, you have the pro-choice, as long as Roe v. Wade remains law, pro-choicers are going to advocate that the status quo remain. And on the other end of the spectrum, you have pro-lifers who are going to be advocating for the ending of Roe v. Wade. Should Roe v. Wade be overturned, obviously that dynamic shifts. So, activism can, you don't always have to be seeking change. You can just be seeking to maintain the status quo and still be an activist. And, I don't know that the fundamental definition of activism has changed. I think that, and we can get into this some later, I think as we talk about specific examples of what things that are being called activism in this time might be a distortion of that definition that I just offered.
Yeah, good. Kind of wanted to tee that up because I do think it's evolved a bit. It's not necessarily just protest, but anyway, we'll get to that hopefully. Cost again. So back in 2018, I think you mentioned reputation and earning potential. Any difference in today's landscape that you're?
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that would be the mental health perspective. You're hearing a little bit more about that today than you might have, like the mental health cost of just being an activist, whether you're an athlete or not. Like there is a wear and tear and a weight that comes with being an activist. And there's no reason to believe that athletes would be exempt from that. So I think that is worth them kind of accounting for when they're doing kind of the cost benefit analysis. Like their mental health should be a part of that calculus. So that's an additional thing.
Earning potential still significant in the calculus at some level?
I think that it kind of depends on the athlete. I think it's less of a potential cost than it was 2 years ago. And I think recent examples kind of bear that out. I think players who might not have been felt that they had the job security to speak up 2 years ago feel like they have it now. And so to that extent, financial security might be less of a factor. I do think there's still value in something I suggested a couple of years ago, which is that there's value in players kind of coming together, whether it's a formal coalition or not. There's a value in players coming together and maybe deciding who can most take the hit and who can most afford to be the most vocal. I still see there being value in that because someone under their rookie contract just might not want to take that big leap. And that's understandable. But you have a player who's if we're talking about NFL, if we're to have a player in their second or third contract and who might be already thinking in terms of their transition away from the sport, they might be more comfortable. It might be the better positioned spokespeople for certain causes.
Sure. So I'm going to ask you later if there's a cost of not engaging in advocacy. So I think there's been a change in the climate a little for, you're almost shamed and expected. You almost have a duty. A call to arms is now your duty, which is so different than we've had the last 20 years, pre Kaepernick, kind of post Muhammad Ali. That era there was a very quiet era for advocacy. But let's get to that later. Let's go to the next question.
Okay, we'll put a pin in it.
yeah, because I have a perfect follow-up for that later. So
okay.
Cost benefit analysis, you alluded this to, and I want you to focus on pro athletes. This is where it got really interesting when you were talking to NBA and the NFL reps and around this at PADS, which is mostly a professional sport oriented organization. We'll talk about college next, and that's changed dramatically.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And we have a lot of people on this call that are more oriented in college, but in the professional space, as a lawyer, employment lawyer, what are the cost benefit analysis that you would talk to an athlete about? Should you be doing this? Why should you be doing that? What are the costs? What are the benefits? What do you have to gain? What do you have to lose?
So, the point that I made at the PADS conference, and one that I think is just as relevant today, because you hear it a lot is, well, it's my First Amendment right to say what I want to say at work. And when it comes to private employers, that's just not the case. You don't have the right to say whatever you want to say if you work for a private employer. That aspect of the First Amendment applies to federal employees. So, that's a myth that needed to be debunked then. And to the extent that it's still lingering out there, I think it needs to be debunked now. Like, you need to understand that if you work for the NFL, and we can get into this later too, despite kind of the intersection of sports leagues, the NFL in particular, with the military and patriotism, they're still private employers. NFL's a private employer. MLB, NBA, NHL, MLS, all of them, WNBA, they're all private employers. And so you have the right to say certainly whatever you want, but you won't necessarily be free from consequences as a result of that articulation. So that's the biggest thing, at least 2 years ago, that I would have counseled folks on. And I know we'll get into it down the line, but obviously I think it's very important for athletes to have a very good understanding of the issue that they're taking on. But you have to be passionate, you have to match your passion with information.
Right. Yeah,
and be informed.
That's actually our next question. Nice lead in. But the advice, I don't think that's, that's kind of like textbook advice we give and the readings that we do. And, when we try to train the next generation of people working with athletes, that is a must. You need to know what you're talking about. You need to be educated. What other advice would you give athletes, professional athletes right now, if you're speaking to them directly?
The other advice I would give athletes, and particularly in this season, I think if nothing else, this season has underscored for me as an athlete development specialist, like the time to get your plan together for your life after sports is now. And when I think, and I know we're going to talk about the collegiate piece in a second, but when I think of, say, the players, particularly from Pac-12 and the Big Ten, who may never play again, and 2 weeks ago, they were going to be playing. They were going to be playing for those in that 1% that actually move on to the NFL. Like they were going to be playing for that goal, with that goal in mind. So I shudder to think what that's like for them to now be confronted with the possibility of not playing football ever again. Similarly, I think that professional athletes are in a less precarious state, but I think this is the time to consider, like, if you're going to be, if you're going to be in this activist space, what's your next step in case the cost becomes too much to bear? Like, what's your plan? What's your plan B? And again, going back to what I previously said, being informed is highly critical to whatever it is they're going to do, because they don't want to step out too far and then find themselves having to explain or backtrack something because they didn't fully understand what it was they were talking about.
Right. Okay. And this is where you did mention, you gave the Rosa Parks example, actually, last time we chatted.
Yes.
Right face for it, not meant for the masses. But do you think now, this brings up the question I had for you a few minutes ago, is there almost, I wouldn't call it call to arms. Maybe call to arms is what, they call what Howie Bryant calls the heritage. This is like the people that are out there fighting for the condition of Black athletes and just Black, in this country, Americans, maybe globally. But in this case, is there a duty to have a voice, to share your voice at the professional level? We'll talk about college in a minute.
It increasingly feels like there is. If you look at the first couple of days of the NBA action starting in the bubble, what made the news was more the few examples of folks who did not who did not kneel for the anthem, and so like the kneeling has become the norm and what's expected and what's almost argued by the NBA demanded. So there does seem to be almost a duty, like where there's been this flip. So whereas a year or two ago, you wouldn't have had NFL players declaring, oh yeah, I'm kneeling, like it's a non-starter, or you wouldn't have had a majority of a team declaring that. My sense is, and it remains to be seen whether we'll get an NFL season this year, but players are already articulating their intention to kneel. And so I think that there is that the players are feeling some increasing sense of duty or obligation to do it.
That's different. That's evolved quite a bit.
That's evolved quite a bit, yes. Right.
Let's pivot to a little more complex landscape in college sports. Maybe we'll just focus on college. A lot of that advice could apply to interscholastic. One thing that's changing and as we speak is name, image, likeness opportunities, where athletes actually potentially, and it looks like, will have actual financial costs that could bear, not just this loss of amateurism, loss of a roster spot, not being able to play, which has been held over them. That's the biggest source of power in my opinion, in the sports industry is this concept of amateurism. But now they may have some power on their side, and they actually could benefit or gain from advocacy directly to their own influencing campaigns or potentially their own sponsorship. So let's put that aside for a minute, because that's not reality yet. That's future.
Right.
But in the current landscape, so we've seen a lot in the current landscape. So we have a few examples. I think this was probably one of the better ones. Is this something we would have seen last year, year before? Is this something we're going to continue to see in the future?
Absolutely not. To have a player from a Power 5 program insist that a state. I mean, this is the brilliance of what Kylan Hill did. Kylan wasn't saying to his university administrators like this must. Kylan was saying, "Hey, state of Mississippi, I'm not playing for one of your state schools unless you remove the Confederate emblem off your state flag." That it almost boggles the mind, like to think in terms of what would have been the reaction if that had happened just a year ago. So yeah, the landscape has shifted so much, you know, in the student athlete's favor, I think, over the last few months. Like this confluence of the racial reckoning with COVID and the empowerment that's kind of coming up from these student athletes as a result. You wouldn't have seen that. I mean, we're in such a unique set of circumstances. You just wouldn't have seen it before now.
Yeah, so they're finding their voice, but I think it's because they're finding that they have power. Tremendous.
Because they have power. Well, I mean, the reporting around when back in April and May, there were projections around, well, in the fall, if college football doesn't launch, the financial costs will be astronomical. Right. Like universities strongly rely, their athletic departments strongly rely on the football programs to generate the revenues for those departments. And knowledge is power. Yeah. And the players were getting equipped with information that finally like quantified their worth in like real dollars in real time. And they know that they're making that type of money for the university and not getting paid too. And I know that amateurism is like, we'll talk about that another time. But yeah, I think that, you know, that's an example of how like this information, now that they know their worth, they're willing to leverage it.
Yeah. So this came up, the Missouri football team a few years ago.
Absolutely.
The first kind of stepped in this direction and got their president fired and the chancellor fired. And they threatened not to play, but they did still play. I think what you're realizing now, I mean, the Pac-12 rumor of a boycott, and obviously now it's flipped and now some want to play. There's a whole counter narrative that's kind of that's entered the space, fortunately or unfortunately. But what the Pac-12 did, and many other conferences have come together to form these kind of Bill of Rights almost, you know, around their health, safety. The Pac-12 went as far as like they wanted, you know, a share of the revenue and all that. And that's again, now they realize they have power. Like if I don't play, you know, it could be. I saw Tennessee was $30 to $40 million they announced. I mean, I kind of know our numbers. I'm not going to share them here. It's, you know, it's tens of millions of dollars.
Yes.
Lost revenue, which means, you know, people's jobs and the local economy. I mean, these players, these 55, 85 guys, you know, that practice and play, have tremendous power in the value proposition of college sports, and they're just starting to realize this. So we saw this with Chuba Hubbard at Oklahoma State, and that was a weird situation. We don't need to get into that case too much, I don't think. But what you mean? Can you make sense of this Pac-12 movement and how, you know, this is they're going to start a coalition? It's not going to be a union, but almost de facto union. I mean, the athletes have found out that we can collude and get more for our cause. And it's the right thing to do. And we have their attention. Right. They being the power structure of college sports. Still there, Michelle?
I'm still here.
All right. We'll move on related to that. So there's a couple just cases there.
I do want to, if I could just offer another example in the college space. player empowerment also taking in the collegiate space, taking on the form of players saying, I don't have to play for this coach anymore. And the Mike Leach example at Mississippi State, in which he shared a tweet of a woman knitting a noose a couple of months back. And he's lost several players to the transfer portal since then, but at least one of them has been very clear that he left because of that. I'm not sure that happens a year or two ago either.
That's going to hurt him in recruiting and other stuff. I mean, the guy that they wouldn't say they woke up. They were just the power struck. COVID created a crack in the system. Power is, I think Howard Bryant says that the only way you can defeat power is with equal or more power. And athletes now feel like they're not silenced, they're not scrutinized, they're not marginalized. And a lot of these pro athletes, what they were greenwashed, just paying millions of dollars, tell them, shut up and play, don't get into that. And they're saying that's not acceptable as well. So dramatic changes. I mean, in the last 4 months, as a sports sociologist, I've been almost shocked by how far we've come in a short amount of time on many issues, like mascot names, for one example, in Washington football team. And then this space here has been just shocking to me. It's just really, we're living through some serious history here.
And let me, if I could quickly offer, as a lawyer, you're typically used to seeing change on big issue topics like this occur over time and, kind of incrementally. To have seen the changes in the power structure and the power dynamic, like almost change overnight in this space, that's atypical for the law too. So just from this lawyer to you as a sociologist, like it's atypical, and I'm floored by it as well.
Yeah, it's awesome, but it's a little. I mean, we're moving fast, so we gotta. That's why we're having this conversation, trying to make sense of it. Who should be giving advice to these athletes? I know we have one sitting athletic director on the call,
yes.
At least, and there's a handful of other people that work with athletes. I could see they've joined us, and many others may encounter this advice down the road. At the current, in August 2020, who should be the trusted advisors to our college and or professional athletes?
Well, this is my self-serving moment to say athlete development specialists, of course, but in all seriousness, well. I think it's a group of people that should be amongst that trusted advisor delegation, if you will. Certified financial planner, mental health specialist. If they don't have the designation athlete development specialist, someone who has a background in human resources that can help them with the career planning and transitioning piece, like very strategically and deliberately. But you almost have to take a step back from doing that type of work. Before you can do career planning and transitioning work, you really have to work oftentimes with athletes to help them figure out what their identities are outside of being an athlete, because so much of their lives have been kind of invested in that piece of that's almost their sole identity. So the real challenge, the prerequisite to career planning and transitioning is doing the identity work to help them understand that they are more than just a basketball, football player, or whatever. So those are the types of professionals that ideally would be giving them.
You didn't mention lawyers.
And
lawyers are very interested now in the college space with NIL.
Yeah, and lawyers as well. I guess we are my blind spot.
Well, like for example, the Alston case that they just lost a week ago that was appealed, not lost, but it could go back to appeal. I mean, the lawyers are, circling the class action suits as we speak. It's just crazy. I mean, my assumption is that's how it's gonna go down. So I'm assuming they're looking at this space too for.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, particularly around NIL. You're right.
And to help, I think last time we talked, you said why not pro bono? I mean, that's what athletes could trust it at this point. At least the college athletes, a lot of pro bono work from experts like yourself to help them. But there was a question, I'll ask it now. Sydney Steinberg asked, with the formation of players unions, for college sports, we're not going to see unions just because the legal challenges or barriers to entry there aren't there, at least not for the foreseeable future. But as I said, are we going to get to the point where there's de facto unions? I showed that Pac-12 icon or picture the other day, and it's for Pac-12 football players only. I mean, these guys were colluding; they were working together. They were
working
Yeah.
similar to how a union, I'm sure they were voting and they were, casting, taking the straw polls of the room and then moving forward with a common cause and a common voice in mass. That's basically what a lot of times they won't be collectively bargaining, but will they have a bargaining asset in their collective voice?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I agree with you. I think we're, a far cry from having officially, official unions amongst student athletes. But yeah, these loosely formed coalitions can be just as effective potentially as a union. And again, you get into the union space, and then that tricky amateurism question kind of seeps back into the conversation as well. But I think that the Pac-12 model that these student athletes are bringing together is a great insight into where the future is headed with regard to how players leverage their power. I think it's brilliant.
And should they be looking to those groups? I guess is that is that a place to look for honest, fair, transparent, and quality advice about how to take on social justice?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
Okay.
mm-hmm.
What practices, for this last couple questions, either shorter ones, what practices do you recommend for athlete development specialists with regard to their engagement with athlete clients? This is a little follow-up, kind of redundant on the last one, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that being the athlete development specialist or anybody doing this work needs to kind of be whether you call them the macro, micro, or the meso factors or not. Like, you need to be aware of whatever factors might come into play with regard to your athlete clients' engagement in social justice issues. I think it's also important from a interpersonal standpoint for the athlete development specialist to have a relationship with the influencers in the client athlete's life. That could be parents, that could be girlfriend, boyfriend, better half, any coaches, from if it's a college player, maybe his coach from high school still has his ear. But the athlete development specialist needs to be attuned enough to and the athlete's friends. Needs to be attuned enough to that circle and cultivating relationships with folks in that circle, because there are opportunities to educate the influencers. If the influencer has your client's ear, and you would identify an opportunity to educate the influencer to make sure that the client is getting, whether they're getting it directly from you or not, they're getting good sound information. I think it's important for athlete development specialists to have that circle, like regard them as pseudo clients almost. And being aware, I think it's also important for them to be aware of the athlete's upbringing, their experiences. In this day and age, I think it's important for athlete development specialists to specifically ask their clients, what interaction have you had with law enforcement? Have you had an experience that you would identify as traumatizing? Or violent or unique, so that you really get into the brass tacks of what that perspective may look like, and how their perspective may be colored by potentially some traumatic experience.
Yeah. Okay. And I'll qualify here when we say athlete development specialists, and you don't have to respond to this, Michelle, but I think we're saying the role of athlete development specialists. I mean, we treat it as a discipline, of course. It's
right.
knowledge. It's also a job. A lot of people on this call do this for a living or want to do this for a living. But athletic directors are athlete development specialists,
Absolutely, yes.
Professors work with athletes and give advice, or athlete development specialists, so the role. So it's great advice. All right, so where else can we get some best practice advice? I think right now we've seen a lot. We in prep for this, we talked about maybe the worst job in sports right now is Adam Silver's commissioner role in the NBA. I mean, that guy went in around this space in this. I don't know. I mean, all the NCAA CEO of, President Emmert's job's not very good either right now. It's a really tough landscape, and all the commissioners of all our leagues and all our ADs, I mean, they got horrible, challenging times ahead of us. But his around this cause, around this issue, the guy starts on the job and he's dealing with the Clippers owner, caught on tape, and now he's in a bubble, and he's got this whole phenomenon around, I mean, they have Black Lives Matter on their court.
Mm-hmm.
At least relaxed the standards and norms on their, on uniform and play, and athletes are speaking up at will. I mean, just in that short amount of time, just how much has happened in that league. And you think he's done a pretty good job. So if you had to give a report card to college sports, the major leagues, who's doing a really good job that maybe we can look at in living laboratory for some insights to help us do our jobs better?
Yeah, I would say that of the organizations or leagues, the professional ones at least, I would give the WNBA probably the best grade. They get some form of an A. In large part because they were doing the work before May 25th, 2020, right? So they've been engaged in social justice issues as a league, not just supporting players who are doing the work, but the WNBA as a league has been putting out initiatives that promote women and girls, and these proceed this year, and last year, like they've been doing. They have a social justice initiative that they've started as a result of the current racial reckoning. But I think what they've gotten right is that they put initiatives in place before things got really tense, and so what they're doing now doesn't seem like it's a wild overreaction or a knee-jerk reaction to the racial reckoning and the protests. And it just looks like it's a part of programming that they had already had in place. How they've supported the individual talent and their superstars who have promoted and advocated for certain social justice initiatives, I think makes them very unique. And if you think in terms of Maya Moore being in the upper stratosphere of WNBA players, if she's in that stratosphere of, I don't know if you want to say LeBron or Kawhi or who, but she's in that stratosphere, to think in terms of one of your top players taking 2 seasons off to go help a guy that she believes has been wrongly convicted get his conviction reversed, that wouldn't happen. I mean, I can't think of another league where she'd be supported in that way. I mean, and if any of our attendees have any thoughts around that, I'd really love to hear it. But the way that the WNBA has stood up as an organization, one, and then how it's supported its individual players and their initiatives, and the teams, when the teams make decisions to take stands, the league has supported it. So across the board, I think they're really hitting the right.
Anybody not doing a very good job? We can look for examples of not to do.
This all, as far as the 2018 conversation, really the triggering point for my curiosity around that obviously was around Colin Kaepernick. And so then you have to look to where's the NFL in all of this? Obviously in June, Roger Goodell made a statement in which he acknowledged that the league was wrong for not supporting the players who were kneeling. He said that Black Lives Matter. But you've not really seen anything meaningful from the league with regard to how teams are going to be allowed or not allowed to present themselves when it comes to social justice issues in the fall, if and when the season gets started. I do not regard the playing of Lift Every Voice and Sing, the Negro national anthem, as a huge concession. Frankly, I have more questions about why for that's not, for me, as someone who has historically watched NFL games and as someone who has a commitment to social justice causes, I don't know that the NFL deciding to play the Lift Every Voice and Sing makes me say, oh, they've really moved the needle on this. So, I think, and owners have been kind of awfully silent about it. I know players, as I've mentioned earlier, have articulated their intent to kneel. Jerry Jones last week, who had been silent for a very long time, made statements indicating that he was going to extend grace around the circumstances. I'm not quite sure what that means. So for this whole dynamic to have been initiated within the NFL, I am disappointed that, let me change that. You might expect for them to be a leader and not a lagger with regard to what they're doing as an organization.
Fair enough.
We won't go any further. We have friends in the NFL as well.
Yes, we absolutely do. We absolutely
Friends,
do.
but yeah, it's a tough landscape, and they have not been leaders on this.
Yeah.
Obviously, and they're still not obviously getting any credit for leading this. I had one question related to this. We have one, at least one here in our chat box too,
Okay.
about amateurism, which we'll get to in our last couple minutes. And people obviously can follow up with. We'll put our contact information on the website.
Please.
If something comes later, please follow up. We're eager to hear and understand this landscape better ourselves, and that's why we're doing this 5-part series. So, question for you though. I was reading the Heritage by Howard Bryant, excellent book about it. And I get to this chapter towards the end of the book about patriotism, and he's talking the whole time about patriotism. Kind of post 9/11, sports has really changed in a significant way around aligning itself with patriotic causes, and why that's happened. I didn't realize that a lot of this is, at least started, is maybe it was patriotic, but has evolved into huge, hundreds of millions of dollars of advertising buys by the military, the Department of Defense.
Yeah, it's a financial transaction.
It's a financial transaction. So now we could see, now it made more sense to me when you have a player who kneels and it's seen as disrespecting the flag, even though after the game, they might be, he makes an example as guys, you could sweat on a flag on a t-shirt. So you could wear a t-shirt that resembles a flag and sweat all over it. But if you kneel during the anthem in a silent protest, you're crossing the line on patriotism. So the NFL is probably the most aligned with this value of patriotism. Obviously, our political climate, this is another macro example. Political climate has clearly moved that direction. Which league is the least kind of challenged by that, do you think? Or all of us, are all leagues? I think we talked earlier, soccer maybe, but we just saw our first soccer game.
Yeah.
And there were boos. 5,000 people in the stand. I think it was in Dallas.
It was in Dallas. It was a Dallas-Nashville soccer game, and it was a first game where fans were in. And just as an aside, I want to answer your question, but it's with regard to the kneeling that's going on at the NBA games and everything. We can talk about like how much of that feels performative at some point, but it's easy to kneel when you don't have. It's easy to kneel when there aren't fans booing you. There's not the I don't want to call it the fear, but any trepidation around it is limited because you don't have to deal with a real-time reaction to what you're doing.
Well, and you're trying to win a game, you're trying to play your best. That you don't need a mental health block to take you out of your potential focus flow state you're hoping to get into and play. So really, you're right. I mean, that's a good point. No one goes to work and tries to be distracted when they're working. These guys are working. This is work, and they're entering. So, but to
answer I do want to answer your question. I think another league that seems kind of that's wrapped in itself in the flag and embraced. Well, probably less. I would probably describe the MLB as having wrapped itself around the flag, maybe less a connection directly with the DoD. But Howard Bryant mentions in his book examples of folks being mad when laypersons don't stand for the 7th inning stretch in which God Bless America is played. And so there is this expectation, it feels as though there is, at least at MLB games, that you're going to demonstrate a certain level of patriotism. Right. That at least I've not experienced that at an NBA game.
NBA is probably the least.
The NBA of the big, if we're going to call it the big three, the NBA is the most immune, if you will, to that.
We'll talk about this more in the series. We got the last couple minutes here. We don't want to be respectful of everybody's time, but
sure, of course.
To that end, though, I read an article yesterday, USA Today, around the NBA's been struggling for as good as job as Adam Silver's done in many of these challenges facing his league. They've lost half their viewership on TV over the course of his tenure, or something in that range. I mean, it's a different question. It's a complex question. We'll get to it later here in a couple of weeks. Hopefully that'll be part of the future of this. There's cost for athletes, there's cost for leagues and teams. And Brian even said, he goes into the details. To throw out a first pitch
at a baseball game, average price $7,500. You got to pay for that, right?
Yeah.
So you see the soldier out there throwing it, and then he's reunited with his family, and he's been been deployed. It's an awesome feeling. You're almost pitting the athletes versus the soldiers. I mean, it's become and the athletes have become politicized because of this marketing activation, a business transaction.
Right.
I mean, there's lots of other things. All right, quickly in the last minute or two, we had a question from Hunter. What are the negative consequences of amateurism? So I teased that concept of amateurism. So if amateurism, I guess, was no longer about the NCAA, I think I understand the question, Hunter. But I mean, amateurism is socially constructed. It is what it is. I mean, at one time, the Olympic athletes couldn't do commercials. And now they're paid and they're still called amateurs. I mean, it's an amateur, but professionals play, obviously, in the Olympics. The whole Olympic movement has just gone away from this concept altogether. The definition of amateurism in college sports has to change. It has to. They finally, the law has caught up with the brain trust or those that have led us to this point in college sports. And coupled with this, this grassroots and the micro level, the athletes gaining some voice by being realized that they have some power to yield and to fight power with power. So I don't know. Do you have any? You probably don't study a lot of amateurism, so maybe not a fair question, Michelle. But any thoughts on this idea of amateurism evolving and with the future of college sports as a result of the social justice kind of work that's going on?
You're right. I don't study amateurism, but I do have an observation, and it's one I've made with you before, Dr. Segas. Even in the context of COVID, I do know that the lines of amateurism seem to be getting blurred by the day. And so even last week, when a part of the reaction to the Pac-12 student athlete articulation around social justice issues was this: we want to play, and an ancillary point made from that was, if our football players are safer here than they are if they're not playing and go home. How do you send them home if they're still students? Like, why are they going home? And if you send them home because they're not playing, then they begin to feel like employees and not students. So I just think there are a lot of blurred lines that can come into play. Just my observation is, like, universities have to be very careful how they treat their student athletes with regard to COVID and the amount of access or control they try to exert over them in this time.
And inject in the calculus this huge moderator where they found their voice and they're not afraid to use it collectively or individually. And you got a whole new ball game for this construct of amateurism that, like I said, is socially constructed, and we're going to reconstruct it here this year. COVID's, if there is, there are a few silver linings in COVID, not many. It's been a horrible reality and a life-changing event for us here, especially Americans. But there will be some things on the other side of this, and that's what we're going to talk about here in the next few sessions. So our next session will be actually talk a little bit about the past, the history of this. We really do need to understand it if you're going to move forward. Where have we gone? I have to say the past started 3 months ago to Paul Robeson, maybe was the first.
Yeah.
From that era there, and but now we're in this present, this new normal. I will put the link up today for that session. Actually, everyone that's on here, I'll just send you an email, just reminding you that it's available. And you can just delete the email, please, if you don't want to be bothered. But great session. Thank you very much, Michelle, and we'll
thank you.
Look forward to continuing this conversation. And I think we just kind of scratched the surface there. There's a lot left to really get into. Really understand this, and then when we get to that last session, really understand where we're going. So
absolutely.
So thank you. Appreciate everybody joining us.
Yes, thank you guys.
We will hopefully see you in 2 weeks at the same time for our next session.